and welcome back to another episode of Civics Ain't Dead. We're still kicking, and we're here tonight to talk about a question that we don't really have an answer to. So thanks for being with me, Josh. We're going to be talking about sanity tonight and how we stay sane in this crazy world we live in. Basically, the idea behind this is, last episode we talked about media consumption, we talked about news cycles, and after we were talking about that, Josh, I think I said to you that, like, well, how do you stay sane, or how do you cope? Really, it's a question I'm asking you, Josh, because I don't actually know the answer to it, right? And it's the dilemma that I've been kind of wrestling with. And I think you've been wrestling with since we started this podcast, and probably before we started it, is like how to stay civically engaged, how to keep up with current events without just doom scrolling and obsessing and becoming like a news feed junkie. And I have not found that balance. But part of the reason we started recording these conversations is because I'm trying to find that balance. So that's what we're here to talk about tonight. So any initial thoughts on that, Josh? Before I have a couple of questions I jotted down that I think we can talk through, and just like compare notes. And I'm sure this will resonate with other people too, who are trying to stay sane in this disturbing era.
Yeah. I mean, I think you laid out one of the two sides of the issue, which is like kind of overinvesting your time and doom scrolling and losing sight of like the importance of just living your life and functioning as a human being. I think the flip side is, maybe just as bad, if not worse, which is burying your head in the sand and being completely apathetic and cynical about the political process and your personal role in it, and doing nothing and completely disengaging. That it's really like, I don't think we're trying to ask how do you strike a balance between being civically engaged on the one hand and being apathetic on the other hand. I don't think apathy is at all good, but there is a way to healthfully disengage, right, and prioritize kind of your life and your career and your interests and your hobbies and things that we all want to be doing, right? And I don't think people want to be actively engaged with American politics on a daily basis. I certainly don't. I'd much rather be doing my own stuff.
I mean, if you wanted to be actively engaged with American politics on a daily basis, you should go into politics, right? Or lobbying or newscasting. And neither of us did that. So, no, I don't think the majority of us want to do that.
Yeah. But I mean, I do think the other thing I'll say just to start is like, we mentioned in either our first or second episode this Steve Bannon quote about muzzle velocity, kind of like the fire hose of news. And the idea again being, if you just, as he says, flood the zone with story after story after story, the media system and people's media consumption habits just won't be able to keep up, and things will fall through the cracks. And I mean, we really are seeing that within the first 5 or 6 months. I mean, it's a perfect case study of that idea, right? I mean, just 2 weeks ago, the whole country was talking about ICE agents in Los Angeles and other big cities, and kind of the deportation or the kidnapping of people who are not criminals. And then the topic completely shifts to conflict in the Middle East, and the news coverage is 100% about that. And I'm sure next week it'll be something else. But it is so hard to keep up, and it's so hard to reconcile the speed of that news cycle with what the news is actually about, which I think we would both agree is pretty terrifying in a lot of respects.
Right.
So yeah, I don't have any answer either, really.
Right, and vigilance is by nature exhausting, right? So if we're told that democracy is fragile, you've got to stay vigilant. Yeah, well, it's tough to stay vigilant every day, right? It's tough to stay vigilant and keep up with every executive order, every X post or truth post or whatever, right? It's exhausting, and you never know what the most up to date news is unless you're just sitting there refreshing your whatever news app you use or turning on the TV and just watching it scroll across. So that's the hard part, right? And it is so tempting and so peaceful when you turn it off and don't think about it. Um, but I think burying your head in the sand is exactly the wrong move, and it's exactly what someone like Steve Bannon probably wants some people to do, right?
Yeah.
I yeah. Um,
Just one more point to make on that is sometimes it's actually more harmful to kind of hit the refresh button on the news app. I Not harmful, but
it is
more obfuscating, right? I mean, it was last night, I think. We were hearing this news from Trump about the ceasefire, and then I guess because of the differences in time zones, there were missiles launching after,
still being dropped.
and it's
Yeah,
like you're seeing people report that the ceasefire has been broken. You're seeing people report that, well, it's because of the time zones. Um, no one really had any idea. And I don't think hitting that refresh button like 15 different times over the course of half an hour is going to give you more clarity than just getting a good night's sleep, waking up and seeing what's actually being said with a bit of distance.
yeah.
Um,
That's a good point, and it actually, I mean, that's one of my questions, right? Is like, have you figured out, or are there rules you kind of try to live by, ways you limit yourself? I was trying to think about ways I've tried to limit myself. Um, and one thing that harkens back to what we talked about last time in terms of media, I think, I find it at least a little bit better to read the news rather than watch it on the screen, right, in real time. I think in one way it removes the emotional component, right, of kind of these like talking heads that are breaking news flashing at you, kind of overstimulating in a lot of ways, right? Waking up the next morning, like you said, reading a concise rundown of it in as objective of a place as you can. My preference is the BBC because I figure they're not even in country. But um, whatever your preference is, I think reading it as opposed to like hearing it on the angry radio or seeing it on the big screen makes a difference. At least for me, and I think it would make a difference for our parents' generation too if they did that. That's just a plug for long form journalism.
yeah, no, I think it's the biggest moral of the story for us is reading matters. Um,
Right.
it's a very, I mean, reading and watching are two very different sensory experiences, right? They happen at different speeds.
Yes.
They
Reading
engage
helps you
different.
slow down, yeah,
Exactly,
and
and
think
it, and
through.
it and it's just a slower process. It's a harder process. It's a more active process. But your brain is putting in work that it isn't necessarily always putting in when you're just kind of more passively consuming news via a screen. And when we did the media episode a week ago, I don't think we even realized the only things we were really talking about were screen media examples, because print journalism is, I think we would agree, so much better for a number of reasons, like some of which you've already laid out. I would also say, like, I think it's just helpful, and this is only, I mean, it's this is easier said than done, but it's always good to have a separate frame of reference against which to judge what you're seeing in the news, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, for us, we're trained historians, so we can kind of apply what we're seeing in the news against our what we've learned and amassed over the course of early careers as historians, um, to help make sense of it. But it doesn't just have to be history. It could be economics. You could be an engineer. You could be a scientist who has knowledge on how vaccines work, or whatever. Um,
Or you can just apply the common sense test, right? And say, okay, I'm going to triangulate what I'm hearing with my common sense. Is my world being inundated by illegal criminals? Oh, wait, no, I've never actually run into an undocumented person who has threatened me or my business or my livelihood or whatever, right? I mean, that's just one example, right? But comparing what you're hearing on the news with what you're seeing in reality around you, are they crazy leftists, or are they the neighbor next door that just happened to vote for Joe Biden when you voted for Donald Trump, right? Um, and no matter where you live in the country, you know, you should be able to triangulate that evidence and use a little common sense, I think, unless you've totally siphoned yourself off into some corner of the internet. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's a way to kind of just live on Facebook and, repost memes from propaganda outlets that, or troll farms that acknowledge on their pages they're not even real.
News, yeah,
But I think generally speaking, the moral of the story is like reading, slowing down the process of thinking through the issues, and also getting information from like published sources generally is the way to go. And that's not to
the
say every
safer
book
way.
out there is good. I mean, certainly there's plenty of, I was just reading some of the titles of Ben Shapiro's list of works, and they're pretty interesting, I guess. So there's definitely ways to read and also misinform yourself actively. But generally speaking, right? Like we need to be doing more reading, I think, as a society, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
One thing I'll say, just, Timothy Snyder, I've mentioned him a few times now. He has a quote in one of his chapters in the book or the pamphlet on tyranny. He says, quote, staring at screens is perhaps unavoidable, but the two-dimensional world makes little sense unless we can draw upon a mental armory that we've developed somewhere else. When we repeat the same words and phrases that appear in the daily media, we accept the absence of a larger framework. To have such a framework requires more concepts, and having more concepts requires reading. So get the screens out of your room and surround yourself with books. And that goes for people on any side of the political spectrum, right? It's just as easy to go on CNN or MSNBC and just regurgitate what they're saying, and you're not really doing that
yes,
critical thinking for yourself in an active way, right?
right, yeah, yeah. Well, and I'll say that that's one of the great things. One of the payoffs for doing these recordings, Josh, is that it has forced me to go back and reread things that I just kind of took for granted, right? Like, um, you know, I don't know when the last time I actually read, like Federalist Papers, right? In detail, other than assigning little snippets of them in a class or something. And I had to kind of go back and do that and reread the Constitution, right? Like when we were talking about what kind of powers of the purse Congress has versus the president, what Doge can do and what it can't do. The war powers stuff would be relevant, but it forces you to go back and again vet what you think you know, vet what you're being told by the talking heads on the screen, and vet what you're reading. And slowing that process down, I think, takes the emotion out of it, makes you think through it. And that's all stuff that is readily accessible. That's not like you've got to be in some ivory tower locked away to access that stuff. You can find that anywhere. Um,
But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think I would say the biggest way I'm staying sane is just deciding to do this podcast, which, um, was always kind of the impetus. I was like, I'd probably texted you 2 or 3 times, and the gist of the text was, I think I'm losing my mind. I need to
yeah,
do something about it. And
yeah,
and we're not trying to like become full-time podcasters, but at the end of the day, my kind of stance has always been, if it helps me cope and deal with this and I can learn some stuff that I probably haven't
yes,
thought about since my government classes in high school, that's a net
yes.
positive, right? Just
That's right.
for me personally, and if anyone else is listening and gets something out of it, that's just a bonus. um, but yeah, like in terms of staying sane and finding a way to just make sense of the world right now, I think being active with the podcast has helped me tremendously.
Right. Well, and I think that's the balance that I would convey to anyone listening too, right? That not everyone needs to just like start a podcast with their buddy. Um, uh, there are different ways that we can take these small little concrete steps that feel like you're doing something, and relying on the expertise of others to handle other areas, right? Like I'm not a legal expert. I cannot go down to immigration court and defend people who have legitimate papers, to be here. I can't, I'm not, um, I'm not in a government position where I can challenge certain orders or question certain authorities. Um, so going to a No Kings protest, that's one way that people can do it. That's easy and accessible and concrete and maybe makes you feel like you're doing something. Doing a podcast, writing an op-ed, right? I've got some friends that have been just like churning out op-eds, and good for them, right? Maybe I don't feel qualified to talk about some of these things the way they do, but I think each of us, trying to find the ways that we can do our best. Um, uh, I read a C.S. Lewis quote today that said, "The more often a man feels without acting, the less he will be able to ever act. And in the long run, the less he will be able to feel." And so that, when we started this podcast, I think that was my impetus, right? Is like, if I don't do something, I'm going to explode or I'm going to cease caring, which is even worse, right? So I'm either losing my mind or I'm becoming apathetic to what's happening. And so I wanted to do something. Now, you could argue, well, a podcast isn't the only thing you could be doing, and that's true. But it at least feels like, I'm engaging, right? Which I think is the whole point of why we call it Civics Ain't Dead, right? To engage civically is like half the battle. And then what you do with that afterwards, if we were sitting here arguing against well-informed people who just disagreed with us on policy, I think that we'd be in a much better place as a country, right? But that's not necessarily what I see happening. It's not what you see happening. There's a lot of ill-informed people, or people that just kind of, I guess, think that allegiance to a man is the same thing as allegiance to country, and that starts to get scary.
Or just people who are generally cynical about the government as a whole, and
Yeah,
have lived an entire life from, let's say, the 1970s onwards, with that sense of kind of disillusion in our, at least our federal government, right? Which is a very
yeah,
real, very palpable thing that
and somewhat understandable disillusion, right?
completely understandable, yeah,
Yeah,
um, and historically traceable, and something that we've talked about here and there, but certainly could spend a whole episode on. Um, but I feel very well suited for the moment personally, and I think especially you and me as friends who share a lot of the same sentiments, both historically and also just as two guys, two schmucks. Um, but that doesn't come from the fact that we're like PhDs or whatever. It's more so from the fact that
yeah,
we have these kind of blue collar upbringings in rural Pennsylvania and rural Ohio, and we've been surrounded for much of our life, if not most of our life, with people who now politically we would say, "Are you guys crazy?" Um,
yeah,
and certainly our training as historians plays into that as well. But I feel like I'm coping mostly because I feel like this podcast is helping me channel that bridge in my brain in a
hmm
constructive way. I mean, it is also worth saying, I think both of us share sort of an anti-authoritarian bent, maybe, where we like to
yes,
fancy ourselves like, outrunning a posse in Wyoming and then escaping to Bolivia. Um, so I really feel like this is the moment for us to speak up, and that it, as we've said before, it takes courage to do that, which is whatever. But also it's like you do struggle with that. Like, well, is it my place to do it? Am
yeah,
I the person who should be speaking up? Which reminds me of a phrase that's cropped up a lot recently. I know the Ezra Klein podcast just talked about it, and the phrase is that it's not my job to educate you, and
uh-huh.
that's something I've struggled with in the past. But like, what are your kind of initial thoughts on that idea?
Yeah. No, I mean, I've heard that phrase for a while now, and I think back to like, especially 2020 and Black Lives Matter movement, and that it's not. I heard that phrase a lot from friends of color. My wife's not white, right? So like this idea that, well, it's not on a minority group to educate the majority group about why they feel oppressed, right? And at the time, I understood that sentiment. I think now it gets kicked around in a lot of ways because it's exhausting to try to reach across the aisle now and try to reason or educate the other side, right? Or explain why we see a constitutional crisis when they just see an election mandate playing out, right? Um, and I think it is my job now to educate anyone who's going to listen, right? And especially, I think you and I can say that we're two white dudes from, again, rural middle America. Like, if we don't do it, who will, right? Like, it shouldn't necessarily fall on the minority, uh, um, on a minority person. It shouldn't fall on the most vulnerable, right? Like, an undocumented person shouldn't be the one educating us on why they still have constitutional rights. It should be a multi-generational white American, heterosexual man with two kids and a wife who has enough stability, enough privilege, if you want to call it that, right? Um, to stand up and say, hey, actually, this isn't right, right? Like, I think that the onus is on people like Josh and Johnny, not to sound like messiahs here, but like, it's on everybody from whatever place they can um, to make the argument, right? And I'm going to keep doing it till I'm blue in the face, and people on Facebook are exhausted with me for posting about, like, hey, this is a violation again of a constitutional norm, right? This is a violation again of like human decency. This is antithetical to your Christian faith, even though you think Donald Trump is somehow God's messenger, right? If people want to call me a stormcrow or people want to call me a crank, I guess that's better than people saying, well, I didn't hear anything from him when it was all going down. That's kind of that's the uncomfortable place that I am becoming more and more comfortable with.
Yeah, yeah. I think I'm in agreement there. I mean, I think there's a certain idea about activism fatigue, right? Where it's like if you are in an underrepresented group or a marginalized group, the expectation is that you're leading the charge. And I think we're at a point with any of these issues, but certainly the country at large, where if you're willing to speak up and say
Or
something,
do it.
I think you just do it. I mean, and it doesn't have to be a podcast. It could be a one post on Facebook, kind of letting your fellow friends and family know where you stand. I think the more people who start to speak up, even in the smallest of ways, is that's kind of the foundation on which we're going to get back on track as a country. Not just in terms of like making sure we don't slide into authoritarianism, but like actually having conversations and healthy debates about issues, which was already a problem before Trump ever came along. And
Mm-hmm.
certainly is going to be a problem once he's gone. So the other thing I'll say about this idea of like education, I mean, it does risk sounding pretentious to say like, oh, we're getting on here and educating people, and I feel like there's ways of like framing yourself as an historian. You know, as anyone who's been in grad school knows, like you have to get so niche in what you study. It would be a lie for us to say even though we both specialize in American history, we understand everything. Like we
No.
absolutely do not. And a lot of times we're getting on here and talking about like the fairness doctrine, and I'm like, well, I googled that like 20 minutes or like it's like there's a way of being comfortable in knowing your research skills can provide good sourced information quickly. But in my mind, what what I see as my responsibility as an historian is like modeling how I think through issues, modeling how I access and interpret information in the digital
Mm-hmm.
age. Because I don't see our problem as a country being, oh, well, we don't know enough about Bacon's Rebellion. I see our problem being we don't know how to go on Facebook and understand that what that little square box of text is saying is completely nationalist propaganda that doesn't have any basis in reality, or
Untethered.
or
Yeah.
we don't
Yeah.
have any understanding of like, well, what Trump is saying there is completely untrue, or whatever the case might be. And
Yeah.
being an historian, I mean, being any kind of humanities scholar, but certainly being an historian equips you with what I would call like a bullshit detector, right? Like a spidey
Mm-hmm.
sense
Yeah.
of like of BS. And
Yeah.
I think us just publicly modeling how
How
that
we
works
think
for
through
us,
that.
how
Yeah.
we think through it, and how we sense and call out the BS and sift through all of that is important to do, and much
Yeah.
more so than like citing random amendments or talking about
Right.
certain political events in the past.
Yeah.
Although that's also important.
Yeah, well, and the other thing too, and this is even more basic and in a way more personal, right? But if you listen to the national news outlets, you could easily fall into this narrative that the other side, the people opposed to Trump, are a bunch of lefty, wackos on the coasts with funny colored hair and too many degrees and all this kind of stuff. And like, just part of what I see us doing here is like putting a you know, a Josh and Johnny face on no, like there are everyday normal people, young dads with kids, people with jobs all over the country, people from Ohio, people from Pennsylvania, whatever, that like are uncomfortable with what he's doing, right? And that doesn't make me a radical leftist. It just makes me a reasonable person who has some critical thinking skills, kind of knows American history, broad brushstrokes and a few key areas, and also knows, yeah, how to like sift through information and say, this doesn't make sense. This maybe does make sense. What's the background to this thing? What's the context to this thing? And like, you know, remind people that it's okay to question elements of this regime, even if you voted for him, right? Like, it's okay to say, like, boy, I don't know that I should be rounding up people holding green cards. I don't know that they should be able to like grab somebody without a warrant, right? And I know I keep coming back to the immigration thing. I guess that's what's in the news in my mind right now. But there are a number of other elements here too, right? Like whether it's financial budgets or cutting Medicaid or whatever. Like it's okay for you to say, "Hey, I voted for him," but cutting Medicaid, that seems wrong, right? Or
And
whatever.
it also wasn't what he ran on necessarily in
Ran
a lot
on.
of these
No,
cases.
no.
So you could say, I didn't vote for this. And you probably honestly didn't, right? Like he completely disassociated himself from Project 2025 multiple times, only to turn around and say, well, this is actually the playbook. So, I mean, you could say, well, maybe we shouldn't be believing what he's saying on the campaign trail, which is fair. But
Yeah.
just because you voted for a guy doesn't mean you got to stick, you know, with him
There,
through the end.
there's no such thing as a mandate to rule in the United States, but that's a separate topic. Let's back to sanity, right? And this is, I think, where we're talking through is like this is, I guess, the motivation behind what's making me tick, what's making you tick, why we're doing this. But it's also an outlet. It's therapeutic in a way, right? Because we have real lives at the end of the tape, at the end of the day too. And as animated as we get on this podcast, it's not the most important thing we do on a daily basis or a weekly basis or a bi-weekly basis. We've got kids, we've got wives, we've got lives outside of this. So I don't know. Do you have ways you kind of put it aside? You said, go to bed, get a good night's sleep, pick up the news the next morning. I don't know. Are there other things that are like bringing you joy right now, Josh? Because I've seen this too. I'm sure you have that. Like, seizing the little everyday joy is in itself an act of resistance in a way, right? Like not just falling into this kind of depressive state of like, oh my gosh, the world's falling apart.
Yeah, it reminds me off the top of my head of the quote about the gay men in the 1980s during the AIDS epidemic, who talked about how they'd protest and be activists in the morning, and then they'd party at night, and it was like,
Uh,
what's the point of fighting for these rights and these issues if we can't enjoy ourselves as well? That's
yeah,
what this is all about.
yeah,
So obviously I should have pulled that quote up beforehand, but that's the gist of it.
No, it's a good sentiment. Yeah. Yeah.
But no, I mean, like, I don't, I just, like, I try to live my life. I hang out with my brother online, play video games with him. I, spend time with my kids, go to every freaking playground in the greater Los Angeles area, like every other day, and try out all the different slides. It's just like normal stuff. I mean, just like living your life and asking yourself, if nothing crazy was going on in the world, what would I be doing? And then
Yeah.
doing that, you know,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
that's my only answer to that. Which
No,
is
I
kind
think
of the
that's
point.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because what do you, well, I mean, what are you active for? What are you fighting for? Well, you're fighting to be able to live a stable, normal life, right? And for right now, at least for people like you and I, our day to day has not been radically shaken. I don't feel threatened in my daily life yet, or anything like that. I understand that there are people that do, and that's not okay. But um, yeah, trying to enjoy the moments with my toddler daughter and my recently toddler son, right, and my wife, right. That's all important, and being able to have a conversation, calling up uh, a family member and being able to talk about normal stuff without getting into a political fight or without just veering into politics right away, I think is still worth kind of protecting some of that. Now, that's not saying don't ever bring it up, don't bury your head in the sand, right? But I do think trying to find these moments and not and Shruti is better at this. My wife's better at separating things, and so one of the things, like, I get yelled at if I look at my phone while we're playing with the kids, right? And because she usually catches me looking at a news app or something, and so that's not good. So I'm going to try over the next month to be even less on my phone than I am now. I think that'll help. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't also be paying attention to what's going on. So it's the constant balance. I don't know. And you find different outlets, right? Like you say, the kids are a blessed distraction. They're also an inspiration to keep, being vigilant. That you want them to grow up in a free society. You want them to grow up with a constitutional government, right? And so, I'm not going to sleep on that. But that so again, an escape, but also an inspiration.
Well, the idea that it's not affecting us personally yet. I mean, if there's one basic history 101 lesson that
Yeah,
anyone
from the
who's ever taken a
yes,
course in like 20th century American history knows, it's that doesn't mean it won't eventually come back to bite you
yes,
anyways. I
that's
mean,
right.
there's a lot of people out there saying, like, I'm not really interested in politics. I don't have the time for it. I don't have the energy for it. I'm cynical about it. The unfortunate thing is politics is going to end up taking an interest in all of us, whether we like it or
Yeah,
not. And
right.
right now, it might be families of color who are getting, family members deported, even if they've got kids in the Marines. Um, that doesn't mean it's going to end there. And even if it does end there and it never actually directly affects us, I would say a lot of people, would have the moral stance of, well, we should still care, even if it doesn't affect us directly. We should still care about our fellow human beings who are living in the same country as us, at the very least, certainly, and abroad. Why shouldn't we care about that? Why shouldn't we
Right.
fight for their rights and their well-being as well, and try to make the whole world a better place? I mean, it's a bit glib and blithe to say, but it's true.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's not to be melodramatic, right? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, which, is kind of a play on a Martin Luther King Jr. quote that goes back even further than that. But I don't think that sentiment is wrong, and that you always hear the other one about, first they came for X group, first they came for this group, and then if you don't stand up. So I think that, yes, that is a basic level civics lesson. It's also a basic level like morality lesson that we should be speaking up before it gets to us. And yeah, if you see videos of people getting knocked and dragged down just because they're asking for a warrant, or asking a question in a press conference, that should be your signal to start speaking up. But I don't know if we've solved any sanity questions with any of this, but I do think that that's right. That we're kind of beholden, and this is, I mean, it's the burden of being in a democratic society, but it's also the great privilege of being in a democratic society. We are beholden to hold our leaders accountable at the end of the day, right? And that's true going all the way back to the revolution. I mean, if you read the Declaration of Independence, that's what it's all about, right? That you've got to hold your leadership accountable, and if they somehow fail in their duties, it's people's responsibility to call them out and act accordingly as that plays out. So I think that's about as Americana as it gets. But it's that's not it's not a small lift sometimes.
Well, especially when the kind of this ostensible group you're up against would flip that concept on its head and say, we're actually being unpatriotic by having this podcast, and if you want to be a real patriot, you should support whatever the U.S. military is doing, carte blanche, right? So again, it's a question of understanding what it means to be an American, and having some sort of consensus, if that's possible, on that question. And having that conversation with not like random people on the internet, but with like your closest friends and family.
That's
Right.
right. Yeah. 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 I'm not going to win over some MAGA troll on YouTube. Right. And actually, it's not really my job to do that. His mom should call him up for dinner every once in a while and get him to like interact with society. But it is my job. I think there is a certain obligation or duty to, keep the lines of communication open with people who see things differently than me, right? And I appreciate that I've got family members that have reached out and have watched the podcast that disagree with me totally and send me articles about it, right? At least that's engagement, right? And at least in most cases, they're acting civilly. And I think that if we keep doing that, we can get past this moment without a crisis, right? It's when we stop doing that. It's when we stonewall the other side totally. You know, I know history's not cyclical, but I think about the 1850s a lot, right? Where once everyone starts to think the other side is immoral, right, and there is a moral obligation to oppose slaveholding South, or in the Southern case, they think that the North, and abolitionism offers an existential threat. Once the compromise breaks down, you don't get back from that without 600,000 dead Americans, right? And like that's what we don't want. So being able to keep the channels of communication open, despite all of it's hard sometimes, right? Despite all of the phlegm and all of the angst, I don't know, just finding a little bit of grace and remembering that the other people are human too.
Yeah.
At least your family members and friends, right?
Right.
I'm not gonna,
Yeah.
defend the administration, but
I mean, one of the things I wanted to bring up was this idea of no politics at the dinner table. Certainly, growing up, that was kind of the mantra by which we were expected to operate.
interesting.
And granted, I'm not the most easygoing person. I've been told I'm stubborn and always insist on being right. So I can understand both of my parents' decisions on certain levels to not actively invite fights every night. Um, but I do wonder now when it feels like it hasn't ever been more important than right now to have conversations about politics with
Yeah.
our family and our friends. And I find myself feeling somewhat stonewalled a lot of times, and that I can't even. There's just um, a resistance to even engage for whatever reason. It does make me wonder if maybe as I'm raising my own kids, we could have a little more politics at the dinner table. Not to
Yeah.
say I'm trying to indoctrinate anyone, but at least talking
No.
about what's going on in the world, right? That seems to be a
Yeah.
healthy thing that maybe will have a better outcome than kind of the breakdown of communication a lot of Americans are experiencing with their own families right now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as my brother always says it, and he's a lot more empathetic than I am, right? And so I'll give him credit here. But, he always says, like, you got to be able to think, and this is like Americana 101 to kill a mockingbird stuff, right? But, like, you've got to be able to think outside your own perspective, right? Like, you can't just operate as if you've lived in the same county your whole life and never think about, well, how do other people experience this same thing, or how do other people navigate this thing differently than I do, right? And so, yeah, walking around in someone else's shoes, again, a first grade lesson that too many of us have forgotten. um, and uh, and so, yeah, kind of trying to grasp other people's perspectives or trying to understand where they're coming from, um, and listening to how other people see the world. Even if it makes you uncomfortable, it's okay to be uncomfortable. And so, yeah, I definitely, I think encouraging our kids to think about different perspectives, and to think about what's going on in the world outside of their little bubble. Um, I don't even think that's called politics. That's just called, like, well, civics maybe, but also like humanity, right? Who does the bell toll for? It tolls for you. Um, I mean, that's a that's a good lesson, that you can teach a 3-year-old, I think.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, but I guess I would say again, we're trying to figure out how to stay sane. Um, the the hardest pill to swallow for me with all of this has been the sense of apathy. I think that I've encountered for numerous reasons, and I think one of the reasons why we wanted to start talking in this venue was to give people who are busy just one additional potential outlet to get some news and some perspective from again two schmucks who are just trying to figure it out, but who maybe they know. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and it's been a struggle for me in that respect. Not because I want more people to watch the podcast. That has nothing to do with it. Just I would love to just have some conversations that I feel like there's just an unwillingness to have
yeah.
on a lot of fronts, and that's something I'm trying to figure out still.
Yeah, well, and I think, yeah, I don't necessarily care how many views we get, but I do think that a lot of the struggles that you and I have expressed tonight and other episodes, right, um, are things that a lot of people are feeling. A lot of reasonable Americans, right, whether you call yourself conservative or a liberal or somewhere in between, right? Don't like a label of any kind. That's fine, but, like, even if you're apolitical, I think a lot of Americans are seeing such a divided society. They're having these kind of hand wringing thoughts about, like, well, what do I do? What can I do? Um, and the takeaway answer, I think, is not apathy, right? Don't give up. Don't give up on the American experiment. Don't give up on your family members. Don't give up on friends that seem to be, down this rabbit hole of politics. Um, I don't think we can give up, because if we do, that leads to insanity, right? Like, that leads us away from the path of stability and sanity and some kind of, I don't think we need consensus, but we need some kind of civility, um, uh, and, like, good faith approaches, which we don't have much of left. And I don't know, this podcast is just a drip in that much bigger scheme, but whatever little ways we can do it, and whatever little ways any of us can do it, I think is the key.
Yeah, there's a good quote from Ray Bradbury, author. He
Yeah.
was interviewed by Sam Weller in 2010 when he said this. It was published in the Paris Review. So Bradbury says, quote, "Action is hope. At the end of each day, when you've done your work, you lie there and think, well, I'll be damned. I did this today. It doesn't matter how good it is or how bad, you did it. At the end of the week, you'll have a certain amount of accumulation. At the end of a
Mm-hmm.
year, you look back and say, I'll be damned. It's been a good year." So again, yeah, that doesn't have to be a podcast. It doesn't have to be getting a degree in something. It can just be having conversations and saying, I want to strengthen my relationships with my friends and family. I want to try and make the world a better place. And politics absolutely has a role in that. It can't be avoided if that's kind of your underlying sentiment. Um, for better or for worse. Again, I don't think if we had our choice in a perfect world, we'd be sitting here. Maybe we'd be sitting here hanging out because we're friends, but we'd probably be geeking out about Lord of the Rings or something else.
That's right. Yeah.
Not this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to have a podcast about something like, hiking, backpacking, fishing, just fun history trivia,
Yeah,
you know,
we'll
what
probably
era
end up
you'd like to live
sprinkling.
in.
We'll probably end
Yeah,
up sprinkling some of that in, anyways.
we should. Yes.
But
To stay sane. Yes.
yes, exactly.
uh, yeah, good. All right. Well, good. That's a good, encouraging way to wrap this up for now. And we should say we're going to take a little bit of a hiatus. I'm doing some traveling. Josh doing some traveling. It's going to make recordings hard for maybe we don't call this like a summer holiday of like a month ish. So what we'll do is we'll be back here towards the end of summer. We haven't gone anywhere. Don't give up on us. We're still going to be active, and we will see you all back here with more topics. And hopefully, continually snowball effect momentum of better recordings, better sound, and more viewers, right? Is the goal. So we'll all stay sane together somehow by listening and talking through these things. So that's the goal. Good stuff tonight, Josh. That was encouraging.
I'm
And
not.
again, continues to be therapeutic.
Yeah, I'm not optimistic about the better recordings and better sound, but hopefully the rest of it will work itself out.
All right, so we're pessimistic about the sound, the technology, the editing, the world, but I'm optimistic about the summer.
There you go. Get that summer breeze.
Yeah, there we go. All right.
Alrighty.
Well, that's all for now.
Sounds good.
See
Take it
ya.
easy.